It's a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker. He's come here, and timing, they say, is everything in the world. They say that timing is everything in the world, and still can't hear. Okay, that's all right. They say that timing is all that counts, and we sure have some very, very specific questions that we will want to ask our speaker when he's completed his address. Ambassador Moshe Aran was born in Romania in 1934, and he came to Israel in 1950. He served as a captain in the Artillery Corps of the Israel Defense Forces and studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he received a bachelor's degree in political science and international relations. In 1960, he began his studies at Hebrew University's Faculty of Law and received his LLB degree in 1962. He joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at that time as an assistant in the Department of International Cooperation. And in 1964, he was invited by the Ministry of Justice to serve as his executive assistant as well as a ministry spokesman. He was appointed to the post of First Secretary and later promoted to Counselor for Press at the Embassy of Israel in London in 1968. And in 1972, he was sent to New York, where he served as Deputy Consul General. In 1973, he was appointed Minister Counselor for the Information at the Embassy of Israel in Washington. In 1976, he returned to Israel and was placed in charge of the Office of the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and in 1977 was appointed its Assistant Director. During 1980 and 1981, he attended the University of Columbia in New York and returned to Israel to become Inspector General of the Diplomatic Service. In 1983, he served as ambassador to Mexico, and in 1987 came to Washington as Israel's ambassador to the United States. He is married, he has 2 children, and it is a great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Ambassador Moshe Aran.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I hope you can. I have to admit that when we scheduled this meeting tonight, the vision wasn't as clear as to the circumstances that would be around and the circumstances in which we are going to meet. I know that there are many questions on your mind, there are many on our mind. First, after all, we are now almost 3 weeks after our elections, and the question is, when shall we have a government, as Mr. Shapiro just asked me a few minutes ago. What about the peace process? How about Israeli-American, Israeli-US relations? What about the Israeli reaction to the Palestinian National Council meeting a week ago? And so I think that the list of subjects and issues that we have to address tonight is quite wide and quite encompassing a number of critical issues to both Israel and its neighbors, and also to Israel and the United States. As to the question, when shall we have a government, I'm reminded about a story which the late Prime Minister, Mrs. Golda Meir, liked to tell her friends, namely that a good friend of her, one of the Zionist leaders of Israel, and before the establishment of Israel, Shmaryahu Levin, was known for his wit and for his good sense of humor. And Shmaryahu Levin was invited one day to a memorial service for a leader of the Zionist movement who passed away in the 40s. And he attended this meeting, and then the first speaker stood up and started to eulogize the deceased, and he said, now that Bell left us, we are like orphans. We are left without a moral and spiritual guidance. We are actually like children without guidance. And he sat down. Then the second speaker stood up and he said, well, now that Bell left us, we are not orphans. We will continue with his struggle. His ideas will guide us into our future challenges. His ideas will be for us the flag upon which we are all going to get together. And he sits down. As Shmarya Levin walked out from the funeral, from this memorial service, he was asked by a friend, what's new? Or those of you which might understand a few words of Yiddish, he says, was Erzach? And so his answer was, "Mi ken noch gar nicht wissen." In other words, it's too early to say. So I would say this is reflective also as to our situation 3 weeks after the Israeli elections. Unlike your electoral system, you knew the night, that same evening, we are still negotiating. But I think we have to recognize that for Israel, which has established, and for the Zionist movement, which has established the state of Israel in 1948, and which is perceived by us and by the Jewish people in general as a national liberation movement of the Jewish people, I think it's also true that if you look around to the newly emerged states following the Second World War, in Asia or in Africa, Israel is the only country which has established a genuine democratic system of government. We are extremely proud about it, but it also, as Winston Churchill said, there is no system of government which is perfect, and among those less perfect are democracies. And I think we live with it, knowing that the system of representation, of proportional representation, which is the electoral system of Israel, is of course enabling minorities or smaller parties to draw a high price from their potential partners to negotiations in order to achieve a stable coalition that will control at least a majority of the votes in the Knesset. But I would like to say that while there were a number of comments made about the influence of the violence of the last 10 months over the Israeli Arab citizens. And as you know, about 16 to 18% of the Israel's population are Arab citizens, Israeli citizens of Arab descent, and they voted too in these elections. And the notion was that under the impact and the influence of the events of the violence of the last 10 months, we are going to see a radicalization of the Arab vote in Israel. And this didn't happen. In a way, those radical Arab lists, like the Communist Party or the Freedom or the Progressive list, which also reflects a radical Marxist approach, have actually lost a number of seats in parliament, have actually lost, and compared to the previous Knesset, in the new Knesset have lost 2 seats compared to the 8 seats that they had in the previous Knesset. And as a result, I mean, the conclusion is obviously clear that a large number of Arab citizens of Israel voted for the traditional Zionist or Jewish parties, whatever you like to call them, of the Israeli political spectrum. I think this is a reflection and an indication which we all should take notice about, because I think it also is an indication about the fact that the Israeli democracy functions under tremendous outside pressures, political, economic pressures, but it functions and with a ability and capacity to deliver votes, to address the issues, and to confront those difficult issues of national security that the Israeli electorate had to confront. Now, one other comment about the recent Israeli election, which I find it proper in order to give us a background, I think, necessary for all of us to address the issues which are facing now the new Israeli government once it will be formed. I think if one has to characterize the outcome of these elections, is the fact that the Israeli public has expressed its skepticism about both the approach of both major parties, of the Labour and of Likud. Skepticism as to the diplomatic formula that was put forward by the Labour Party, but also skeptic about the notion that the necessity and the conditions require not a military or a solution to the conflict, but they require a diplomatic and political negotiation. And while the two major parties maintained a healthy majority in parliament, I think both parties returned to the new parliament with the understanding that they have together to search, to investigate, to work, to explore in order to find a partner for negotiations. The message of the Israeli electorate to its leaders is one of pragmatism, is one which is telling its leaders that security is paramount in view of the experience of the last 40 years, but it's also sending a message that what is required is the imagination and the necessity to explore new avenues and to explore new ideas in order to reach a settlement. Now, what are the challenges, or what are going to be the policies and the priorities of the next Israeli government once formed? And I feel, in my opinion, that there are three major issues, three major priorities that the next Israeli cabinet will have to address. First, the necessity to reduce the violence in the West Bank and Gaza, to ensure a certain normalcy to the life of the inhabitants of the West Bank and Gaza, of the Palestinians living in these territories, to ensure that law and order could be maintained in these areas, and to ensure that those people in the West Bank and Gaza which are interested and willing to reach a settlement and to work with Israelis can reach this point and can express their views and can go to work every day. Because no one has any alternative to the pure day-to-day economic necessity of the population living in the West Bank and Gaza. And of course, we are talking about 1.5 million or over 1.5 million people, amongst which over 100,000 work in Israel proper and who take home every year $700 million for their work. There is no other Arab country, no other Arab government which can step in or assist or send assistance to those Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, and which tomorrow, if Israel were to close this border, they would actually remain without a source for their economic existence. And so, I think that's important to remember this in view of the issues that I intend to address myself in a few moments of unilateral moves, as we have seen this last week, where the Palestinian National Council not just unilaterally declare the establishment of a Palestinian state with its capital in Jerusalem. So the first priority of the next cabinet would be to ensure that law and order and safety and security of the local inhabitants could be assured. The second priority of the next Israeli government would be to pursue, to initiate, and to pursue a political and diplomatic course in order to reach a settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to the Israeli-Arab conflict. This priority and this approach would be based on Resolution 242 and 338, on the Camp David agreements, and the Israeli government would listen to whatever practical, realistic approach or voices would come from the other side. No one in the Israeli cabinet considers that it is possible, that it's realistic to assume that the violence would take over, or that Israel would withdraw from the territories without achieving a settlement. And anyone who is encouraging this line of thought, this approach, that under the pressure of the violence in the West Bank, that under the pressure of the recognition by the 30 countries which have recognized up to now the Palestinian state, which has no borders, has no control over territory, has no control over anything but offices in Damascus and Baghdad and Algiers. Anyone who supports, encourages the concept that this is the approach or this is a road to solve the Israeli-Arab conflict is actually sending a message of deceit, a message which is divorced from the reality of the Israeli-Arab conflict. Why do the Palestinians find themselves 41 years after the establishment of the State of Israel in the state of affairs and the state of affairs that they are? Why do we see them as refugees? Why do we see them as stateless? Because the Arab leadership, which today suggests that they can unilaterally declare, proclaim a Palestinian state, is actually attached to, committed to the same ideas, to the same notion that has guided the Palestinian leadership ever since this conflict started in 1948, even before 1948. The concept that half of the loaf is not enough. The concept that by military power one can destroy Israel. The concept that the actual establishment of the State of Israel has been an act of aggression, and this is a wording of the Palestinian National Charter, and that the establishment of the State of Israel is null and void. And the Israeli leadership and the Israeli people, when they listened to the voices that came out from Algiers this last week and earlier on, and as they listened to read the interview which Mr. Arafat gave to Time magazine just a week before the Algiers meeting, in which he said that there is no room for a racist state in the Middle East, and this racist state is Israel. And in order to demonstrate that this is not just his view, but this is a commonly held view and concept and ideology, he as support, as the source of support of the credits for this characterization of Israel as a racist state, the United Nations resolution of 1975, which characterized Zionism as racism. And so we hear voices, and I have to say I'm very happy that these are not the voices of the administration, but we hear voices here and in Europe which suggest that what has happened in Algeria has been a tremendous step forward, and therefore Israel has to accept the hand which the PLO is sending out and start negotiate. But I would like for a moment to share with you what does the decision, what does the Algeria meeting, what did they agree upon? And I would like, with your permission, to read for a moment. And it says, the Palestine National Council affirms the need to hold an effective international conference on the Middle East question and its essence, the Palestinian issue, under the supervision of the United Nations and with the participation of the permanent member states of the International Security Council and all the parties to the dispute in the region, including the PLO, the legitimate and sole representative of the Palestinian people. And on the basis of that, the international conference should be held on the basis of Security Council Resolution 242 and 338, and the guaranteeing of the legitimate national rights of the Palestinian people, and first of all, its right to self-determination. And the right to self-determination, I would like to remind you, in this wording means the establishment of a Palestinian state, something which Resolution 242 and 338 do not call for. In accordance with the United Nations resolution relevant to the right of self-determination of peoples and the illegitimacy of seizing the land, and in accordance with the United Nations resolution relevant to the Palestinian question. What are the United Nations resolutions relevant to the Palestinian questions? They are exactly the same resolutions which were passed by the United Nations General Assembly, not by the Security Council, and which call for the return of all the Palestinian refugees into Israel. In other words, that we should agree to accept over 1 million people which are determined, dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel. We are supposed to take the medicine which would eventually lead to our destruction, not immediately, not in the next month, but this is a formula for the long-term destruction of Israel from inside. What are the other United Nations resolutions? The one I mentioned just earlier, the United Nations resolution equating Zionism with racism. And if Zionism, which is the ideology which is at the very foundation of the establishment of the State of Israel, is a racist ideology, then of course there is no legitimacy to the state which has been established on the foundation of this very ideology. Among other resolutions, there are also resolutions dating back from 1948, 49, that we should return to the lines of the partition which Resolution 181 of 1947 called, when it called for the establishment of a Palestinian state and of a Jewish state. And so, 41 years later, a leadership in Algeria, without recognizing the legitimacy of the State of Israel, actually characterizing, without going into other details of this resolution, which I will not read tonight, calling actually the government of Israel a fascist entity, A government which says, a resolution which says on one hand, or a body which calls on one hand to end terror, but on the other hand which regards the continuation of the armed struggle inside Israel as legitimate. A body which has committed himself back in 1985 not to commit any more acts of terror, and it's reminding every reader that they are committing again to the same resolution which they accepted in 1985 in Cairo. And I don't think I have to give you a list of the children, women, and men who died in Israel as a result of terrorist attacks since 1985. And somehow we are looked upon and asked, why aren't we more magnanimous or more sensitive? And if this is not enough, it also declares that Jerusalem is the capital of this new state. In other words, you gentlemen, you are there since for the last 40 years. That's not your country. That's not your capital. It's ours. And if anyone needed further clarification as to the exact meaning of these declarations, Mr. Arafat was asked in a press conference following the end of the sessions of this Palestinian National Council in Algiers, whether this statement means the recognition of the State of Israel. And I hope you are not surprised if I will tell you that he was evasive again. But what he said is now that the ball is in the American court, as if the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, and Israel and the Arab countries, or the conflict between the Palestinians and the Arabs are with the United States and not with Israel. And the history of this conflict is that Israel's existence has been rejected and is still rejected by the majority of the Arab world, with one honorable and very important distinction, namely Egypt. Because when the Israeli public opinion and the Israeli leadership was challenged, not by violence, not by war, not by economic and diplomatic boycott, not by rejection of its credentials from the United Nations, but by an Arab leader who was willing to come to Jerusalem and say, gentlemen, we are here to stay and you are here to stay. Let's negotiate, because we realize that by force it will be impossible to destroy or to bring about the destruction of the State of Israel. Israelis reacted in a way and in a manner and in a form which has been unprecedented. And the rest is history. The fact is that we are 10 years later in a peaceful relationship with Egypt. Yes, we would like to see this relationship warmer. We would like to see this relationship flourishing, or with more content to it. But the fact is that for the last 10 years, not one Israeli soldier or not one Egyptian soldier died along the Israeli-Egyptian frontier. So what are we telling actually, apart from rejecting the PNC resolutions? What we are saying, let's start by step one. Step one in such a prolonged conflict is let's look into an interim settlement. Let's look into the solution of a temporary autonomy. Let's establish an authority which would run, a Palestinian Arab authority which would run the affairs of the Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza for a given period of time, 2, 3 to 5 years. And during this period, let's negotiate. Let's see what is the final way to solve this conflict. One cannot expect that this conflict can be resolved in one conference or by unilateral declaration of a state. But then the concept is that that's not necessary to talk to the Israelis. It is necessary to impress Washington. It is necessary to impress those who have, in the Palestinian view, control over Israel. And they still live with the notion that actually Washington is handling Israel for better and for worse. This is where the fallacy of the concept that one can impose a solution by using international pressure, by sending delegation to Brussels or to European capitals or to Washington, or by coming to the United Nations. By this, are they going to make Israelis more receptive, more sensitive? And I would like you to know that, yes, we recognize that there is Palestinian sufferance. And there is a Palestinian who are encountering and which have been living now for 21 years under Israeli occupation. Is the way to solve about is to make a statement in Algiers? Or to come to terms and to see what are the concerns of the Israelis? Are they concerned, well-founded? And how we address them? None of the above. And this is the second priority of the Israeli government. Now the third priority of the Israeli government, which is linked to the previous two, and is part of a traditional policy of the Israeli governments ever since the establishment of the state, and especially after 1967, is of course the relationship between the United States and Israel. How can we strengthen this relationship? How can we add to it new perspectives? But I think in order to understand this, and in order to address this issue, we also have to look for a moment, to be retrospective for a moment, into the relationship between the United States and Israel for the last 8 years, now that the Reagan administration comes to an end, and the new administration is about to start in Washington. And what we are seeing is actually that the last 8 years we witnessed the development of a relationship which in its scope, in its perspectives, has grown in depth and in aspects which were unparalleled before. Let me clarify. It is not accidental that Israel is the largest foreign contractor of the SDI project. There are about 4 countries which cooperate and work together with the United States on the SDI project. Israel is one of the 4, and Israel is a country which is the largest foreign contractor for the SDI project. We've seen in the last years the development of a strategic alliance which enables the United States to view Israel as a permanent and necessary base in case of emergency, an area in which we have developed mutual planning, exchange of intelligence, planning and mutual logistics, pre-positioning of equipment, wide areas in which the defense establishment of the 2 countries work together for the last few years based on the 2 memorandum of agreements which have been signed by United States and Israel, first in 1983, the second one earlier this year, in April of this year in 1988, upon which Israel has been recognized as a major non-NATO ally of the United States. This strategic relationship, which has, of course, been developed first and foremost at the initiative of the administration, but of course with the support of Congress, both houses, Senate and House of Representatives. This is a relationship which is not a temporary one, because what is at the foundation of this relationship is not only a temporary strategic conjunction for the benefit of this country or other country, but at the foundation of this relationship is also the fact that what we share in common is a community of ideas, of ideals, of commitment to institutions, to democratic institutions, of commitment to the freedom of the individual, a commitment to the Judeo-Christian heritage, which is at the basic foundation of the existence of our two societies. It is not an alliance with a military junta or with a military group or a group of leaders. It is a alliance which encompasses the political leadership of both countries, both nations, and both peoples. And so these are the three major priorities of the next Israeli government. These are the constants which would guide the leadership of our country, and in view of the statements made by President-elect Bush and by Governor Dukakis at the time in this very city in Baltimore at the Bnei Brit Convention earlier in September. I trust these are constants which would continue to gain the support and to receive the support of the next administration. And I would like to assure you tonight that Israel would be very sensitive and would listen with great interest to whatever genuine voices of compromise, of understanding, of negotiations would come forward from the Arab world, but not to the false voices that we heard last week from Algiers. And in view of the experience of our generation and what has occurred in Europe before the Second World War, I mean especially to the attitude of appeasement, and the notion that in order to reach a settlement, never mind what the price is, smaller countries should give in for the sake of maintaining peace and stability. Israelis and the Israeli government is not going to make this mistake. And one last remark. For the sake of stability in the Middle East, for the sake of those who want to avoid another war in the Middle East, those have to understand, these people have to understand, that further efforts are going to be made in the next few months in order to separate, to draw a wedge between the United States and Israel. And the notion that a wedge can be drawn between Israel and the United States is the most dangerous perception and message that can be sent to Arabs, to certain Arab leaders in the Middle East. And namely, I refer to Syria, to President Assad of Syria. Let me remind you that while we are all absorbed by the violence in the West Bank and the scenes, and they are not pleasant, and then I can assure you, nor are the Israeli soldiers which have to confront this violence eager to implement law and order, but this is our responsibility and we will do it. But while these are the images, the danger, if the major danger to stability and peace in the Middle East is not from these incidents, and not because of the violence in the West Bank. The major danger in the Middle East is the fact that in the last year, in the last 18 months, the world has witnessed in silence the introduction of a new system of weapons, namely ground-to-ground missiles with chemical weapons, with chemical heads, the use of gases against both armies and civilians, and kept silent. And this has sent the wrong message, in my view, to a number of Arab leaders, but especially to President Assad of Syria. And if the perception is created that a wedge can be drawn, or there are different perceptions, or they are drifting away, Israel and the United States. The danger that this will be read as an opportunity to initiate another war against Israel without hesitation, using what the Syrians do have already, ground-to-ground missiles, and the capacity to develop chemical weapons. This is a major danger in the Middle East, which we have to address ourselves, to remind ourselves about this danger, and to remind our friends. So I'm confident that if the Palestinian radicals and the Arab leaders like Assad will understand that there is no chance to succeed in a war against Israel, that there is no chance to separate and to draw a wedge between Israel and the United States, they will come to a more realistic position, the same way in which President Sadat reached a realistic position. That if you want to reach an understanding with Israel, you have to negotiate with Israel. Not to set the conclusions before negotiation even start. Not to declare the capital in Jerusalem when Jerusalem is regarded as a eternal city and capital of Israel, not only for the last 40 years, for the last 3,000 years. And not to assume that by unilateral moves, one can advance the cause of peace. By unilateral moves as such, as we have seen in the last week, one is actually postponing the hour of truth, when Palestinians and Israelis will have to sit together, face the reality, face the fact that there is, in the Israeli view, there is no room to establish another Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. There is room to negotiate together with Jordan and Palestinians in order to reach a solution to the conflict. And when Israel has expressed its desire and committed itself in the Camp David agreements to observe and implement the legitimate rights of the Palestinians, and we are committed to this agreement, this is the policy which Israel would like to implement it. And as Secretary Schultz said just a few weeks ago, self-determination in the Palestinian context is not the establishment of a Palestinian state, but it has to be looked upon in the context of a solution which will take in consideration Jordanian, Palestinians, and Israeli interest. So I am not here tonight, unfortunately, to tell you that tomorrow, or with the establishment of the new Israeli government, we will see an immediate breakthrough. But I'm here tonight to reassure you that the new Israeli cabinet would be as determined and as imaginative and willing to explore avenues and roads and approaches to a peaceful solution, but will not accept unilateral declarations.
On the proposal for a unilateral withdrawal by Israel from the West Bank, except for certain designated security areas.
This is an area which I have to say Israeli governments, or rather not Israeli governments, Israeli experts and politicians have toyed and suggested and aired and discussed for the last 21 years. There are several attractions to this unilateral solution, namely that we will decide unilaterally, of course, on our paramount strategic and security concerns and needs, and accordingly, without actually negotiating or drawing a map, we will establish a new reality, a new map, or new lines. Probably we will find a number of Israelis who will say the most difficult thing among the Israelis is to agree among themselves what are the areas of absolute national security requires. But where do I see the shortcoming of such an unilateral proposal? It is again suggesting to Israel it will do what we are telling the Palestinians that they cannot do, namely unilaterally deciding. It's true, we are in control of these territories, but it's also true that we regard these territories as the subject of future negotiations between us and our Arab neighbors. If we hope, as we do, that the hour would come in which Arab leaders would show themselves willing to negotiate with Israel, we have to present ourselves at the negotiating table with certain credentials. And I feel that a unilateral move would actually take away from Israel these assets. So basically, there is a lot of debate on this subject in Israel. It obviously has some attraction, but it obviously has its shortcomings. I do not see the next Israeli cabinet likely to agree to a unilateral move or to decide at this stage what are the strategic areas necessary to maintain the safety and the security of Israel and to withdraw from the other areas. Though it has, as I said, also its attraction.
Mr. Shapiro was wondering if indeed you did not reach a land for peace settlement, then what would the demographics of Israel look like 20 years from now, and could you indeed continue a Jewish state?
Well, I have to say that the issue of territories for peace is an issue which is open to the decision of the political process in Israel. The fact is, there is one thing which I want to clarify to all of you, I'm sure you know. These territories are under Israeli control since 1967. During these 21 years, we had the first 10 years a labor-controlled government, and since 77 to 84, a Likud-controlled government. From 84, we have this special kind of cohabitation, as the French call it, government in national-wide coalition. It is a fact that none of these governments, not even the Likud government, which between 1977 and 84 was in control, decided unilaterally to annex these territories. And they kept them, and we keep them in trust for future negotiations. And so I'm not trying to minimize the ideological differences between the Labour Party and the Likud Party. But what I'm saying is, Israelis have to be faced also with a choice. The choice can be given to them only in the context of negotiations, and only if they have a partner that is willing to discuss peace with them. If not, we will have to be there. Do I see this as a prospect which is conducive to peaceful resolution? No. I hope that there will be also an understanding. And I think in a way, Palestinians living in the West Bank today in Gaza have a sense of urgency. A sense of urgency which the leaders of the PLO in Baghdad or in Algiers did not have for the last 41 years. And this is why we have seen, under the pressure of the Palestinians living in the West Bank, a very kind, unclear, confused statement. But I would say that even this statement would not have come out without the pressures coming from the people who understand that those who are dreaming about the destruction of Israel are dreaming and do not live in the reality in which the Palestinians live in the West Bank and Gaza for the last 21 years. And they want a solution. They are still intimidated. So Israel does not want to include these 1,700,000 Palestinians into Israeli population to make them citizens of Israel. And so if someone has asked, are you genuine when you say that you want to negotiate? That's my answer. Because of course, if we include them into Israel, we are changing the demographic character of the state of Israel.
The question, I think, is whether your long-term solution contradicts in any way the original agreements establishing the State of Israel.
Well, I must say I'm not sure I understand your question, but I will try to address what, in my view, or my interpretation of your question at least. We are 41 years later, after a resolution, actually almost 49 years, but 41 years later since this resolution of November 1947 has been passed by the United Nations, which called for the establishment of two states. The Arab countries surrounding Israel and the leadership of the Palestinians living in Palestine at that time rejected not only vocally this resolution, but actually invaded Palestine in order to ensure that no such state or no such development takes place. In May 1948, when the State of Israel was established, and before that, we called upon the Palestinian Arabs to establish their state, we will establish our state, and to try to live in peace. This was rejected. This was rejected, and a war and an invasion of Palestine occurred in 1948. Once the war ended, the Palestinians had the opportunity to establish their own state in the West Bank, which was between 1948 and 1967, a state of their own. In Gaza as well. The fact that this did not occur, this did not happen, not because of Israeli opposition to it, because they rejected the concept. Because they rejected the concept of the existence of an Israeli state, of a Jewish state. And they rejected the concept of establishing a separate Palestinian state. Now history, my dear friend, is not something that you can put, it's like putting Humpty Dumpty together again. Once it fell, it's broken. You cannot return the clock of history 41 years back and expect Israelis, after the experience of the last 41 years, to come and say, okay, let's forget about what happened. Let's forget about your intention. Let's forget about aggression. Let's forget about the price that we paid for our maintaining our existence in this 41 years. And as if nothing has happened, we are going to accept a solution to a conflict which has been overtaken by the reality on the ground.
Did you send a null and void statement to the United Nations?
I don't have to address myself to the statement of the United Nations.
You're still bound by your own signature.
I don't think that there is any signature if you will look into the documents of the United Nations, because when the United Nations declared this, we were not in existence, and by the time we established our independence, all these leaders and all these countries were determined to see that this resolution cannot actually be implemented. And you are requiring us today, or if I understand correctly, you expect Israel to come and say, we will not have anything to forget about what happened in the 41 years. You are welcome today to take over Jerusalem, because you regard Jerusalem as your capital. You are welcome to take over those territories, because we have suddenly seen the light, or you have seen 41 years later the light of reason, which is they still didn't reach. Now, I don't think that any country in the world has any obligation whatsoever to commit suicide in order to comply with the United Nations resolution.
The question was, is there any consideration being given to political reform in Israel today to deal with the complications of a proportional representation system in which minority parties can drive a very hard bargain vis-a-vis the common will?
Yes, the answer is that serious consideration is being given to a reform of the electoral system. I think actually is the first large demonstration which occurred in Israel in the 2 weeks only after the elections were over, was a demonstration last Saturday night, about 8 days ago, in Tel Aviv, in which supporters of both major parties joined forces in a call for electoral reform, because we definitely, with the present electoral system, minority parties have an undue influence and impact over the political process and over the formation of a new cabinet. And I hope they will succeed.